Alright, so welcome back everybody. So today we're gonna start with the paper presentations first. This is going to be the first group of presentations. So the way it works for the presentation is that we go with the order of papers. You're gonna come here, you're gonna share your Zoom links. I'm gonna share my Zoom link with you. You just join and you present from your own laptop. The microphone is here. It kind of captures everybody's voice, but I think it would be better if the person who wants to present stays here and then everybody else switch. Other people feel free to pause them and ask questions, but at the end also I think it would be helpful to ask some questions. Let me see, is there anything else? Yeah, and then I'm gonna make some notes and I'm gonna share the notes with you as kind of like the feedback for your presentation and your grades. Yeah, what else? Is there any questions anybody else wants to ask? We good? All right, we all set? Yeah. All right, let me grab this and then you can start.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So our paper is Ghost Talk, Mitigating EMI Signal Injection, Attacks Against Analog Sensors. Our group is comprised of Christian, myself, Hannah, Tommy, and Ian. Okay, so the problem that this paper is addressing is that analog circuits are a lot more susceptible to voltage attacks than digital circuits. And this is because digital circuits require higher voltage for interference, while analog circuits operate on a much smaller voltage magnitude. So it requires a lower voltage for such interference. So EMI, or electromagnetic interference, can attack these circuits and induce false signals. And in particular, this paper is addressing these types of interference in regards to cardiac devices. So the impact of the problem is that essentially these EMI attacks can give the attacker control over the victim devices. And this is obviously not really good, especially in medical devices. So in this paper, researchers were able to inhibit pacing in pacemakers, which usually it just helps your heartbeat. And they're also able to trigger electric shocks in defibrillators, both behaviors which are not good. And then in the general case, so the researchers, attacked Bluetooth audio receivers to garble or mimic speech, or in their case, they forced the listener to listen to Weezer's Island in the Sun on repeat.
So the researchers studied two broad categories of EMI attacks. The first one was baseband attacks. The idea is that these analog sensors, they have a particular band in which they are tuned to be able to detect signals, something like a low frequency signal like that of a heart rate in a pacemaker. And so the idea for baseband attack is that you inject a signal at that base frequency. It can work, but it requires a lot of power because most of these devices, they're not resonant at that frequency. The actual, like the metal components, they're not designed to be antennas. So it's not very efficient with consumer grade hardware. But if you do have the very strong, very strong attack hardware, you can, the way that this attack is unique is that it can actually attack sensors that have filters that do filter out higher frequency signals. Now, the second attack that was also studied here was amplitude modulated EMI attacks. So the idea is that, well, perhaps we can't effectively send a signal of this lower frequency over electromagnetic waves, but maybe there's some piece of metal within our device, our medical device, that is resonant at a much higher frequency. It acts like an antenna. And so you can actually modulate this by picking a higher baseband, or excuse me, picking a higher carrier band, and then modulating it with the amplitude to basically mimic that lower frequency signal and mess with the hardware in that regard. This is normally defended against in most devices by filters that remove high frequency signals, but there are some less controlled hardware devices that don't have the filtering. The researchers were able to attack some of those.
Next, I'll be covering ways that the paper discussed we can defend against these types of EMI attacks. So the first category is at the analog layer. I'll be covering the solutions and how they evaluated it and the results. So first we can have shielding. It's pretty intuitive. You just coat your equipment with a conductive material. And in the paper, the result was they tried to measure how much power needs to still be emitted to induce the same amount of damage. And they concluded that the attacker must use 10⁴ like more power. And then the second approach is using a differential comparator. Here, they're using a reference signal to compare voltages across when you're not being attacked versus when you are. And with that reference signal, they can clean out like a transformed signal later, such that to yield like the original signal. And then the third way is through a simple filter. This means attenuation, which is a fancy word of, which is a fancy way of saying, let's filter out all signals above or below my intended frequency band. And the results show that they were able to measure an attenuation of 40 decibels, which was measured from an 836 megahertz attack. As for the digital side, this encompasses more like logic level decisions. So the first is signal contamination. So the method basically comes down to measuring your received signals so you're going to have your reference EMI levels in an ambient setting, meaning it's like a known value, it's your ground truth. And then you're going to measure your EMI signals like outside of that ground truth, and then you can plot them against each other. And in this way, you can kind of apply a formula and then calculate your contamination level over time. And after you have that signal contamination, this isn't necessarily a separate method, but after you get that signal contamination, you can then apply adaptive filtering, meaning based on if your contamination level exceeds a certain threshold, you can then filter out some of that signal. And they were able in their study to obtain a clean signal from an earlier EC13 modulated attack, which they devised in the paper. And then the third method is if your component, whether it's a cardiac device or a commodity electronic, if it's able to measure its actual range of motion, its actuation, then it can then use that range of motion to detect whether it's being attacked. So in their study, they used a heart simulator from UPenn, and they noticed that it was actually able to measure a 10 millivolt response within a cardiac pulse. And they were able to detect it 40 milliseconds after the attack. So they show that this is a viable method.
Okay, so to conclude, for medical devices, they also tested trying to affect a device that was based on the same solution to mimic the human body. And while they're able to interfere with like a 10 watts between 1 and 2 meters distance, they found that in the same solution, they were only able to really affect the device within 5-7 meter proximity. So regardless of the defenses, it is still like not feasible to really affect cardiac devices beyond 5 centimeters. However, even though that it won't have too much of an effect on these medical devices in this particular application, this still doesn't mean that we can't or shouldn't defend these devices in general. We encourage the industry to adopt these digital and analog defenses in the medical devices, as well as commodity electronics, because they are also being used in many, many other avenues that might have other workarounds that can be exploited. And we specifically regarding this signal contamination detection, I think it's using that kind of detection will be easy to figure out what kind of attack is being used. And I think it is important because of the proliferation of all of these devices. And so even though the medical device industry is pretty well regulated, it's still up to us to find out if there's any other applications where critical analog sensors are not as well protected, because as mentioned in the paper, analog sensors will pretty much always trust what they're reading, and it's up to like the interface above that to really figure out like if it's a valid reading or not. And so with a combination of these analog defenses, we'll be able to really figure out if we're being attacked or not. Yes, and of course, these experiments also assume access to commodity hardware, but how and how will these change with specialized equipment? We'll need to determine in future experiment. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. For the floor for questions. Anybody wants to chime in? Yeah, this is it's an important like an example of what we discussed in the class as well for sensors, right? And this one is particularly important because like you can see the impact, right? So for example, let's say temperature sensor, probably if it's kind of like attack, maybe not a big deal, but something like a pacemaker, of course, is important. And then there's also like, you probably have seen stories of like, the vice president of the US had a pacemaker and they're trying to be attacked at. So there is actually kind of, we can see how it's quickly become kind of like a political thing or something similar to that sense. But yeah, and then as a result, like the more critical the device becomes, then the more security, the more focus on the security aspects of things. That's why medical devices in general are really, really regulated everywhere. So they're saying for the security purposes, ensuring that it's not really attacked. But even there's not like final solutions. There's still kind of like an evolving domain of attacks and defense. Yeah, thanks. Good job, guys.
Thank you.
Yes.
As you're yeah, so as I said, today's next group can come. Today's papers are going to discuss basically the idea of sensor attacks in general, right? And you were seeing kind of like different versions and flavors of these sensors attacks. The EMI attack was one of them. We can see more next two presentations as well. Disconnect your audio. You don't need to.
Okay. I'll just share my screen. Let me just do slideshow. Yeah. And you see where it is. I'll just do this. Okay.
Right. So. Yeah, whoever wants to speak, it's better to be this way. This one. All right, whatever, right? This is 2-1, right?
Yes.
1-2, sorry.
1, 2. Yes. Okay. Guess I can start. Hi everyone. Today I'm going to introduce a paper about detecting audio deepfakes through focal track reconstruction. Let's talk about what the problem will actually. Okay. So let's talk
Also
about.
introduce yourself.
Oh,
and
okay.
which year are you at so that we know.
Oh yeah. So hi, I'm Gordon. I'm a first year MSCS student.
Hello, everyone. My name is Vincent. I'm a second year MSCS student.
Hi, my name is Alex. I'm a first year master's. Hi, I'm Changyan or Charles. I'm a first year master's of computer science student.
All right.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk about what is actually the problem that we're actually trying to face. So let's say I'm a true Swiftie. I really love Taylor Swift. And let's say someone is trying to scam me. So then maybe I receive a call from Taylor Swift. I'll be like, oh wow, I'm so important. And then she's like, oh, I have an emergency, and can you send me some money? And then maybe as a true Swiftie, maybe I'll send the money because I think, yeah, that sounds like Taylor Swift. Maybe she's really in an emergency. And then you might think this scenario is quite ridiculous. Like who will actually fall for this scam? But in a week, like last week, there's actually a scam that is an AI generated ad that use Taylor Swift's voice to actually scam people with like shipping fees. So this is actually quite common. As our technology advances, there's more people that want to exploit this part. So before talking about the paper, I'll introduce some background on this research, which is how voice works and also what is deepfake. So how voice works actually is a different combination of your vocal tract anatomy. So let's say if I say who, the oo sound is actually a rounded, close, and back phoneme. What do I mean by that is your lips are round and your jaws are retracted, and also your jaws are lifted and your tongues are retracted. That's why it's called round, close, and back. So when we actually say this phoneme, then in reality, everyone will have a very similar anatomy in their vocal tract. That means that everyone, when they say who, they all have this part in their vocal tract. And we might be wondering, what is the importance of deepfaking, or what is actually deepfake? So there are three very key important parts of deepfake, which is an encoder. You can think about it as when I feed in the victim's voice, go into an encoder, the encoder will extract all the different features from voice to create something called speaker embedding. You can think about it as it's like the feature or like the characteristics of how the voice are being made. The second part will be the synthesizer, which is I feed in the words and also the speaker embedding. Then I spit out something called spectrogram. Spectrogram is almost like a fingerprint of a voice, but it's not still yet the voice yet. So to generate the waveform for a voice, we need to go through the vocoder to actually generate a voice. Now you can think about it as this whole process, we ignore the process of our vocal tract, the physical construct of our vocal tract, and we'll go in depth on what's going on here.
So now that we kind of have a background of how deepfakes work and how, you know, your voice actually works, one thing we noticed, as Gordon mentioned, is that deepfakes don't actually take into account the physical shape of your mouth that you need to like make in order to produce the sounds that the deepfake generated. In essence, right, deepfakes based on the vocoder, like the fingerprint of your audio sample, essentially it's just trying to minimize some loss against some like model that I learned about the victim voice that is trying to impersonate. Like the same way, like if I really wanted to, right, I could try to make my own voice sound like a whale or like a parrot. And then to like the uninformed layperson or amateur, that might sound super similar to a different animal. But in reality, right, my voice, since my vocal tract is not like 5 meters long, I can't produce the same vocal ranges that a whale can, even if to a human being, whatever sound I'm making might sound like a whale or a monkey or whatever else. So this is the idea that the researchers are trying to test. That's a hypothesis that the researchers want to use. Is it possible to use these type of vocal tracts that are needed to generate these deepfakes, to discriminate between true deepfakes and authentic audio samples? So with that idea in mind, in order to test the hypothesis, the researchers used actually a much stricter threat model than what's usually assumed when trying to discriminate against deepfake attacks. We talked about like threat models in terms of like cryptography and like public and then like ciphertext attacks and chosen plaintext attacks. But when discriminating against deepfakes, generally the assumption is that you're working for like a public figure, like a politician or a celebrity. You have access to lots of publicly available data of true audio samples from your like victim that you're trying to defend against. So the idea is you can train a discriminator using true audio samples and deepfake samples, train a discriminator to detect if an audio sample is real or fake. But in the threat model, the researchers are assuming, they're assuming that for any given victim, right, you might not know who the victim is at all. You might never heard of them, never seen them. Given an audio sample that's trying to impersonate that victim, are you able to differentiate based on that one audio sample? Is the audio sample a deepfake or an authentic sample?
So the way that the researchers modeled the solution is by using a bunch of different sized tubes with different cross-sectional areas and diameters to kind of model the way that the throat and oral cavity is shaped. And then when someone speaks, there's both positive, what they call positive and negative flow. There's air going in and out. And then based on the different cross-sectional areas of the pipes, there's a different relationship formed with how the air moves. So they represent all of this with an R coefficient or a reflection coefficient. And they use this to pass into some sort of transfer function, which goes then into a loss function. And from that, optimal R coefficients can be determined. And then those coefficients can be used to reconstruct the throat and oral cavity. So this diagram kind of goes a little bit more in depth of what I'm talking about. So on one hand, we have this audio sample that can be from a deepfake, and that's passed into a Fourier transform, which then outputs a frequency response. So we have a frequency response that corresponds to a deepfake audio. And on the other side, we have some arbitrary R coefficients, and those are passed into a transfer function, which outputs another frequency response. So now we have two frequency responses, one corresponding to deepfake and one corresponding to the R coefficients we chose. And we subtract them to represent our loss function. And then we minimize that and use gradient descent to get another set of R coefficients, which actually should correspond to that which was required to create the deepfake sample. And then the researchers reconstructed the size of the cross-sectional areas of the tubes representing the throats using their data and tests. And it seems, and what it shows is that the deepfake data corresponds to cross-sectional areas that represent a thin tube from the throat and mouth, but the actual data of organic voice samples correspond to a more realistic throat and mouth. So upon testing, evaluating with the test data set, the researchers found that the model actually performed really well. So they managed to achieve a precision of and recall of 99.5% with a false positive rate of only 2.5%. And if you haven't learned it or you forgot, here's the formula for precision recall. And another remarkable result that they found is they plotted this histogram, which basically plots the percentage of features classified synthetic for each deepfake sample and organic voice sample. And they found that the samples that were classified as deepfake, a vast majority of them have a very high percentage of features that are classified as synthetic, meaning that the decisions performed by the classifier are mostly very decisive, and very few are near the decision boundary of 0.5. So that's another remarkable, it shows that the classifier really has pretty remarkable performance. But despite this, there are some limitations of the study that could require some future work. So first of all, the pipe series model that the researchers used only works anatomically for vowels, and it's not a physically correct model for consonants. So one area for a potential future study is to construct a more sophisticated acoustic model that can more accurately model consonant sounds as well as vowel sounds. And another limitation that the researchers ran into was that they didn't have access to a wide range of deepfake data that they could test their model on. So they don't actually know the real world performance of this model on like a wide range of deepfake samples. So future work could be to test this model on those on a larger corpus of deepfake samples. And finally, some discussion questions for the class. So one question that you might have thought of when you were looking at this is, why can't an adversary just incorporate this voice model into their deepfake generation? So the researchers did think of that, and they tried that, and they concluded it would take around, it would greatly slow down the training process, and it would take around 130 days for a single sample. So I guess the question is, if an adversary has sufficient resources, sufficient compute power, and they're trying to target a real high-profile target, could they possibly reduce this time enough to make it worth it for them to actually incorporate this voice model into their deepfake? And another question, another question is the researchers took advantage of pairs of phonemes that are good differentiators of deepfakes while also being common in English language to optimize their model, so they don't have to check every single phoneme. But they didn't check this for other languages as well. So I guess one question is, does this work for every language, or does it only work for English and a few other languages? So yeah, just discussion questions for the class. And so thank you for your time. We have come to the end of the presentation. Now we can take any questions that you have.
Thank you. You go back to the discussion. Think. Anyone wants to comment on this or questions about this? Yeah.
Is it expensive to deploy this on a small device, this model?
So the model itself, I believe it's a relatively small model because they're not training like a full deep learning model. They're only training like a small model trained on on the phoneme data set, and then they're just sort of checking whether the deepfakes fall within thresholds of like this model. So it's not actually a very expensive model to deploy, and I think
The training might take more time probably, but the actual detection part shouldn't be that.
right.
Yeah, one.
I don't have a question.
Oh, okay. All right, Thank you guys. I think, do you think that, other languages might have this, have you thought about the second bullet points, and do you have any answer for it?
I think like maybe some languages, for example, like languages with like really big consonant, like what's that called? Like with a lot of consonants together, like Slavic languages, maybe that they might have some issues.
Yeah. Did they comment on the impact of the model on different languages, or did they try it on different languages?
From what I know, they didn't.
All right, thank you guys. It was great. How many of you have used or seen any video for deepfake? Yeah, so it's actually the Taylor Swift one is actually a great example. This I was saying that the other day. Apparently, US Congress is planning to do some actions over kind of like detecting fake data and kind of, combating against these kind of like, campaigns. Especially because of this particular incident. And generally this high profile incidents is always great for awareness about security. Yeah, you guys can comment that. And deepfake specifically is kind of one of those scenarios where let me just put the zoom in first. Yeah, deepfake is one of those scenarios where it's clear that the wrong information can be easily generated, and we need to really like figure out a way to protect it. Yeah, so let's do the third one, and then I'm gonna then start talking about it. Speakers just.
So hello, everybody. We are here to talk about the idea proposed by the paper, laser-based audio injection attacks on voice controllable systems. So I'm Bharti. I'm a first-year MS-ECE student.
I'm Parangat. I'm a first-year master student as well.
I'm Jim. I'm a second-year master student.
Okay, so voice controllable systems, we have heard of a lot of technologies like Siri, Alexa, which have been pretty much useful and they have like made our lives easier and probably lazier. But so where does the problem actually arise from? We are under the assumption that microphones can only detect audio signals. What we don't know is that they can detect light signals as well. That is amplitude modulated light signals. They'll be able to interpret that as a form of sound. So that is what this paper mainly focuses on. I mean, technology never fails to surprise us by coming up with something out of the box. So before moving on to how to address this basically and to come up with solutions, we have to think about the level of threat. We have to gauge the threat that it poses. So threat model. So what does the attacker basically know? Attacker usually knows about the physical device or the target device on which the attack has to be made. So, for example, if they are planning on attacking, like say Alexa, they'll purchase that and they'll study the physical characteristics of that device before starting the attack. So, what is the goal of the attacker basically? Obviously, it is to make our lives harder, but main goal is to inject malicious commands so that they can take control over the devices which are integrated with voice control. So, for example, imagine your Tesla car is stuck in a traffic signal and it's waiting for the signal to turn green, right? So, imagine a command which translates to turning off the car or the engine is injected. Obviously, nobody wants that situation, right? So, that is one level of thinking. And the resources. So, this can be done with pretty much cheap resources, lasers, and level of access is they cannot physically take control of the device, but as I already mentioned, they'll be able to see the device and that is a form of getting feedback basically using the LED lights that glow whenever the device turns on. So when it comes to the victim, obviously what needs to be protected is the device which is integrated with voice control. And the level of protection that voice controlled systems have these days is not up to the mark, I'd say. They lack user authentication. That is, while we have some kind of PIN authentication for Siri, Alexa on our phone and phone devices, it's still not enough for preventing such attacks. This will be addressed later on in the presentation.
So we can look at the contribution of this paper. So what they claim is to use a laser source to transmit a signal that is mimicking the audio signals. So it has a characteristic of low frequency signal, and it is transferred using envelope modulated signals on top of the laser. And how this device vulnerability comes from is the microphone openings actually allow the light to interact with the metals inside the microphone. So basically the quantum interactions of light and matter translate this laser signal into electrical signals. And we can see their testing setup in this figure. They have a telephoto lens and a laser mount to transfer the laser signal. And they're transferring the laser to the device with a very large distance, about 110 meters. And they're trying to target the openings of the device. And how they choose their targets is just the most popular commercial products, such as Alexa, Siri, Google Assistant. And they choose the commands such as what time it is, set the volume to 0, such as purchase a laser pointer or open the garage door. And we can see even within 20 meters of distance, they can achieve 90% accuracy. Their target can achieve 90% accuracy to perform these commands. And with distance, these accuracies go down. And we can also demonstrate the performance on different products. Then let's highlight 2 of them, such as Google Home. This is one of the most significant results because they can achieve a target with 110 meter or plus distances with a very low power laser. And there is no authentication in this device. So it is easier to achieve this attack. However, in iPhone XR, there is an authentication service. However, with a large, bigger, powerful laser, they can still achieve this attack within 10 meters of distance. And we can look at the attack scenarios. They can have a low power cross-building attacks, as we showed, and these consist of precisely aimed lasers, which are low power. But they can also have authentication attacks, such as pin brute forcing, bypassing, eavesdropping. They have card security problems, as we discussed previously, such as engine start, open door, or park. And these attacks can also be stealth attacks, such as volume controls to immediately control the volume, so the victim will not notice this attack. And they can use the wide range of attack frequencies, so it will not be visible to human eye.
Now we have a demo showing the first kind of attack, the cross-building attack. Displayed. So just to give a background, so in this, the command being sent is, okay, Google, open the garage door to a Google Home device from a building which is like 50 meters away. So they are modulating the command and sending it through a laser, as you can see in this. So they have modulated the command, okay, Google, open the garage door, as you can see it on the spectrum. And it is mounted with the laser with the telephoto lens, and it is being projected onto the neighboring building. The device is supposed to be there on the window as a test device. It is hitting the window here, the device here. And it detects the signal and it automatically opens the garage door. So no human intervention was needed. Just by using a laser, they were able to get access to someone's garage. And this was from a building a little bit far and through a glass layer. So as you can see that this attack is very much effective. Talking about the countermeasures, how this can be avoided. So what the researchers suggest that we have 2 kinds of approaches. The first is the software-based approach. So the first thing is we can add extra authentication layers. So that such as the user must be required to speak extra security measures such as a password or a PIN before actually executing the command. The second is sensor fusion. So nowadays all the devices have multiple microphones on them. So like Google Home device has like 2 mics on either sides. So a good approach is to verify the audio from both the devices, from both the microphones, and then judge that if it is actually a human voice or just a modulated signal. The last software which we just saw in the previous paper, the detecting audio deepfakes. If we have a mechanism to deploy such a model on a Google Home device, then we can find out that if a deepfake is being used to access the garage door or any kind of attack. The next is hardware-based approach. That's very intuitive. So the first is we can cover the device physically so that the light never falls on the microphone port directly. Such as the Google Home device has a little fabric layer, if you've seen the gray colored layer, that gives little bit of protection. The last one is breaking the line of sight with the microphone. So we embed the microphone deep inside the device, such as the iPhone. So we have the sensor deeply inside the front camera. So that's why it is difficult to point the laser directly on the microphone. And so this paper came out in 2020, around 4 years back. So we were looking up some related works which have happened with this kind of attack. So the first one is, as we know, with increased AI, we have increased risks. So some researchers were able to use these spoofed signals to trap a car into some obstacles. So the car was an autonomous vehicle which used lidar-based sensing to detect obstacles and stop or halt accordingly. But due to this laser modulated signals, the car was not able to detect some obstacles, which might be hazardous in some situations. The next one was, in general, crimes in daily life. So some researchers were able to mimic these attacks, and they were able to dial phone numbers or open websites on the victims' computers using the voice command systems. Yeah, that's all from side, and we're open to question answers.
Thank you. Yeah, I like the demo. It's always very nice to see that. I think the moral of the story is never put your voice activated devices by the window, like make sure that you actually shield your devices with yeah. Any comments? All right, thank you so much. That was a great presentation. All right, yeah, the last one.
What's the meeting ID again?
A1
8. Oh, 8.
101 0. No, yeah.
01.
No. 01 88 5.
Very good. Thank you.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
I'm Anton, Zaya, like everything. The title of the paper, our presentation is based off of is pacemakers and implantable cardiac defibrillators, software radio attacks, and zero power defenses. So the problem is that implantable medical devices, or more specifically for this paper, implantable cardiac defibrillators, or ICDs, is that they're susceptible to eavesdropping and interception due to its own lack of security. So adversaries can extract private sensitive data and can send malicious commands wirelessly to the ICD without proper authorization. Why does this happen? One, magnetic fields. If you place a strong enough magnet near an ICD, they'll just start releasing telemetry data and the adversary can just start extracting that. There's no authentication or verification for an ICD, so it listens to everything, making it susceptible to replay attacks. And third, wireless transmissions disclose private data about a patient. So if a patient or an ICD and a programmer are communicating, the adversary can listen on their communication, extract the RF signal, and decode it themselves.
So these ICDs typically have a programmer that is operated by a doctor. So a patient comes in, the doctor has a programmer that wirelessly communicates to the ICD so they can, adjust the therapy or anything like that. And in this paper, the researchers were able to reverse engineer the wireless protocol as well as find the frequency modulation scheme. And after doing so with just a basic oscilloscope and a GNU software radio, they were also able to extract name, date of birth, medical ID, patient history, and more data because all of that is transmitted in plain text. And another problem that Anton mentioned is that as soon as a magnet is brought close to the ICD, it begins transmitting data at the 175 kilohertz FM band. That's because that's the same way that the programmer or the ICD knows that the programmer is nearby is with a magnet. So if an adversary were to bring, in this example, a magnet of 700 Gauss within 5 centimeters, it begins to transmit data and as well as live EKG data. And this system is also susceptible to replay attacks where the attacker doesn't necessarily need to understand the packets, but they can just store them and replay them at a later time. And so this is troubling because they can do these replay attacks and then later on decode the plain text or decode it into the plain text and extract the various data here. For example, they were able to trigger the identification, the ICD identification, such as the serial number and the model and things of that nature. They're also able to disclose the patient and cardiac data and change the stored data in the double EEPROM of the ICD, as well as inducing fibrillation. And one of the most important ones was denial of service by just continuing to transmit and receive data, which drains the battery of the ICD.
So the intuition to address some of these attacks were to, of course, balance security and reliability / accessibility, but also they wanted to consider power consumption of implementing these defenses because, it's small, it's in the heart, it's implemented surgically, it's not the most accessible thing. So their goals were to, of course, prevent attacks. They wanted to draw no power, and that they also wanted the patient to easily detect security sensitive events so that they would know they're being attacked and that they should respond accordingly. And lastly, they didn't want to introduce new failure modes from introducing like a defense. They didn't want more like points of attack for attackers. There are 3 solutions they call zero power defenses. The first 2 being zero power notification and authentication. Notification does what it says. It notifies the patient through a short-range audible sound. Authentication authenticates requests from an external device programmer via symmetric cryptography using a shared key. And it also utilizes a PRF and nonce, as we have learned about in class. They're zero power in the sense that they harvest induced RF energy to power their own systems, so they draw no power from the main battery of the ICD, so it doesn't shorten the lifespan. Third zero power defense is called sensible key exchange. It's basically a combination of notification and authentication also to notify a patient that a key exchange is occurring. It does so through audible and tactile feedback, and what it does is that it provides a session key over a short distance, which the programmer, hopefully the physician, can demodulate, and then it'll allow RF communication between those 2 solely. And their evaluation methodology was mostly just observation for notification, since it was based off sound. They measured sound levels in a simulated model to make sure that it's audible within a reasonable range, like from heart to ear. Authentication, they also just tested the cryptography, the PRF and the nonce together to make sure that it works as intended. And for sensible key exchange, it was similar to notification because it's audible tactile feedback. They measured sound levels and also if they could feel enough of it. They didn't want it to be too strong that it hurts, or that it wasn't strong enough to feel at all.
For the results and insight, papers showcase genuine points of threats of attacks models and these introductory defenses for these examples because the IMDs, they're extremely susceptible to these rapid attacks, especially for these replay attacks and eavesdropping. because it is that these tiny devices are pretty susceptible for information extraction. And how much information, personal information they can extract from these IMD devices. And also zero power for the results, the zero power defenses can mitigate these attacks without drawing extra power from the original system. Yeah, so we gained some insights in the security challenges of the IMDs and wireless communication risks about how much patient information and medical telemetry they can extract from these tiny devices. The defense results were pretty impressive because additional implementations of mechanisms don't obstruct the original functionality of these devices. And additional implementation doesn't increase the original power consumption. So for the future, we want to cope with these rapidly evolving threat models regarding the safety, security, and accessibility of the device, and make more advanced security protocols with authentication and authorization mechanisms such as using a GPIO input. So communicate with the medical device after the GPIO general purpose input output is raised.
So for discussions, what I thought was interesting, I mentioned 700 Gauss for the magnet, which actually turns out to be relatively a weak magnet because rare earth magnets can have a rating up to 12,500. So that means that 5 centimeter distance could be much larger, and that could be within like talking distance that a person is able to, you know, eavesdrop or extract information from the ICD. The other thing that's interesting is that this paper was released in 2008, but some of the vulnerabilities still haven't been resolved. This headline is as recent as 2019, and it found that Medtronic, over 20 models of ICDs and programmers from Medtronic are still, you know, transmitting data in plain text. So still need to do some more work to encrypt these medical devices.
All right. That's it.
That's it. Any questions?
Yeah, it's crazy, right? So you think that, you know, it's the basic communication for a device like this should be like, you know, some form of encryption, right? And then you see that no, it's just regular communication. Anybody can send a message to your device.
Yeah.
So it's one of those examples of like why security hasn't been a consideration when you were designing things, right? And then when you're thinking about like designing something, you always have to also put some effort at least on the security aspects, because, you know, things like this could happen very easily. All right, any final comments? All right, thank you guys. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, so thanks for all the presentation. It was great. This was the first round. We're gonna have a quick break, but before that, just a general comment. I think the format for all the presentations was good. So you want to, other people can follow the same format. That was totally fine. It's okay if you kind of go a little bit over time. Try to stay within the time limit, but I'm not gonna be like you know, deducting points if you're a little bit over, especially if you're actually discussing something that's interesting and engaging. I think one big thing that I saw among almost all the presentations was try to kind of connect with your audience, look at them instead of like either looking this or looking that way. Try to kind of like talk to people, right? And then if you really need to kind of like quickly kind of, you know, look at something to kind of remind yourself, you can, but generally try to kind of talk to the audience rather than talking to either the screen or the presentation, because people are kind of like, just everybody's looking this way, the presenter also looking this way, which is not a good idea. And the second thing is that you can try to actually use things that you put in the slides when you're presenting. So for example, say, oh, look at this beautiful person here or something like that, right? And then most of the time you just speak, you don't really use, because usually there's this kind of rule of thumb that your presentation should be a combination of the content that you show, so people see it, the things that they listen, right? And then the things that they feel, right? So there's kind of three things together. So they see things when you're speaking, they listen to your voice, and then kind of like the actions that you have for changing your voice, moving, and like, making, jokes, stuff like that. That's kind of the feelings that they have. So there's a combination of these three things together. So usually your slide should be supporting of what you say, not necessarily just repeating what you're saying. But sometimes it's helpful to kind of these two kind of also kind of get to converse to each other. Yeah, but other than that, I think it was great. Try to also speak kind of like loud and energetic so that people also try to pay attention to you. But yeah, great job overall. Let's have a quick break and then we come back and talk about the rest of it. All right, so let's continue the lecture. So generally this presentations that you saw was kind of like the main theme in all of them, as you have seen, was kind of attacking sensors in one way or another. You saw different applications, voice control systems that we also discussed in the class, medical devices, of course, any sort of sensors that's kind of like, implemented in an important and critical place. And then you see that there's actually a wide variety of different types of attacks to the system as well, mainly thanks to kind of like improvement in computation, machine learning and algorithms. Things like deepfake are, a huge threat to our society, because, these are very, very advanced methods to kind of create wrong information, right? To fake information. And I think it's now more than ever, it's important to kind of have methods that it can detect this, because, as the technology improves, unfortunately, the kind of downside of improvement of technology is that the attacks and the attacker's capability also improves, right? And so we have to always know this fact and then, do proper actions for it. And then, as you can see, as I said, there's kind of a variable rate of the threat and the importance of the threat, right? So for example, I don't know, your voice control system might get attacks versus your someone's, pacemaker might get attacked, and these are obviously very different things. Or I don't know, like the deepfake could be just for generating like a meme or something funny, versus the deepfake could be used for, political campaigns or for changing things or receiving money and so on. So there's always kind of this kind of range of things that could happen, like, and the more important I think is, of course, there will be more investment and more emphasis on the security. I think that the baseline level, we need to kind of follow specific standards. But once the things gets more and more important, then of course there needs to be even more security solutions for it. But yeah, generally that was kind of like, summarizing what we were discussing in the past week or so about sensor security. So hopefully you get some idea of that field. If you're definitely interested, go and read these papers in more details. And there are many other papers that some of the presenters was kind of pointing out to kind of like other type of things. This is an active area, as I said, in research and in building. There are many companies I know for sure that they're kind of also, when they're building their sensors, they're worried about these things, and so they actually kind of like, this impacts their design. So as a designer could also could impact your careers as well. Okay. Any questions about sensors? All right, so that's kind of like, we are done with that part. And if you remember, last time we kind of started discussing side channels. And we said that essentially side channels is the opposite of the sensor attacks. For the sensors, we are kind of changing the environment and see the impact on the device, and kind of like attacking the device by creating faults, by creating attacks, and so on and so forth. But the side channel is kind of the opposite way of thinking about this problem, where computation on the device will impact the environment. And now if the environment is controlled by the adversary, they can potentially leak some information about our systems, right? There were two things that we kind of need to be worried about. One was generally information leakage, and the other one is forming some form of covert channel or covert communication. And yeah, I explained various different types of side channels, so kind of like two types, and I said that we're going to mainly focus on the analog or physical one. And then examples of analog physical side channels or electromagnetic side channels, power side channels, temperature, sound, generally any sort of physical signals created as a result of the computation that is considered a physical side channel. The big difference between them was that, physical requires some physical measurements, obviously. You need some measurements tools, versus the digital ones that we're not going to talk about much in this class is when you're actually physically there, when you're sharing the same resources, hardware resources, and not necessarily using any physical devices. The main difference between them is you can technically eliminate digital side channels by using air gap computers, which means that not sharing your computer at all with anybody else. Versus physical ones is really hard because you need to kind of secure the physical environment. So you have to put your computer somewhere that nobody can get near to it, right? And then that's usually a much harder problem than isolating your computer. I mean, both of them honestly very, very hard problems to solve, but each one's kind of like that, looking at a different angle. So what is the goal in side channel attacks? This is kind of like where we stopped. So the goal in side channel attack is we usually want to extract the sensitive value, okay? And this sensitive value most of the time is a cryptography key, okay? That's the secret part of the information. Or if it's not the key, is usually kind of like some intermediate variable that is used for attacking the overall crypto system. Because if you remember when we were talking about cryptography, we said that we know nothing about the secret. We know everything about the algorithm. We know the input and output, but we just don't know the key. And then during that assumption, we also didn't assume that there is like internal information that we can extract. So one big thing that this side channel attacks could give us is that that's kind of internal, information. And if you remember, for example, last time I described a fault attack to this crypto system, which we kind of, if you're able to kind of flip one bit during the computation of, let's say, DES or AES, people have shown that this would be enough for the adversary to find the key, because essentially they can control this and flip one bit at a time at the very last step, and then based on knowing what is the input and what is the output, they can like easily just compute a mathematical function in order to find the keys. Similar thing can happen for side channels. If the adversary has access to internal stages of an AES, for example, or generally any crypto system, they might be able to extract it. It's not guaranteed, but there are ways that you can do that. And then the one thing that I wanted to emphasize is that these days it's not just cryptography keys. There are many, many other secrets in your devices that you may want to protect. This includes like, information like private informations, bank accounts, stuff like that. There's also always the software itself might be kind of, intellectual property, especially when it comes to industries and companies, right? So for example, not necessarily the data, but in the general kind of design could be something that's very important. For example, it could take years and millions of investment for a particular company to design a particular software, and now think about that somebody can steal this and replicate this. So IPs these days and protecting the IPs is also another thing that your system might be able to want to kind of protect. And finally, as I said, there's another kind of class of attacks using side channels, and that's mainly for communication purposes, specifically for data exfiltration, which means that if this system, for example, is protected and nobody can really go into that room except occasionally, can I find a way to kind of send this information out, right? And again, this would be a potential attack scenario for systems that are high assurance or very sensitive and so on and so forth. Probably most of you who have done some form of internship probably have seen that most of these companies try to kind of monitors their ports, the the Wi-Fi connections and so on, you cannot really, if you're in the, for example, in the office, you cannot just send out information from your company's laptop. But for example, if you manage to have like some form of a covert communication, then you can then exfiltrate this data, right? So these kind of things is always an important thing in security. So to make it more specific and a little bit more formal, the problem in side channel attacks, or generally SCA, which if you want to call it, is usually we have an X and f of X. And what we are trying to do is kind of by seeing f of X, we see X, or if in more specific way for cryptography, if we have f of X of K, and we observe f of X of K, and let's say, for example, we also know X, from these two, we want to get K, right? And this is exactly what we want to do, for example, in AES. If you remember, the input was the K, and then you can always assume that the F itself is known. So this is kind of like what we call Y-box attacks. And again, for most of these systems, we have to ensure the security of system, even if F is known. And then design is that, for example, if X and f of X is known, and we don't know what K is, then the system still shouldn't be able to reverse engineer and find K. But now what can enable us to kind of detect what K is this additional thing called the signal, or the side channel signal. And using this X, f of X, and signal, now the question is, can I find K, right? So that's really the problem statement here. And then this f of X can be anything. Could be linear functions, could be nonlinear functions, could be collection of these things. So as a result, this kind of like, using this signal and analyzing the signals somewhat becomes more of like a signal processing, or more recently a machine learning problem, really, right? So we want to kind of like, seeing a particular signal in any domain. It could be a continuous domain, a time series frequency domain. It could be specific features or anything like that. And we want to extract some information from this vector, this matrix. And this is very similar to other problems that you have in the domain of AI and in the domain of signal processing in general, that we want to extract something from a given knowledge. Okay, to give you a bit of history of how side channels becomes an interesting thing. So side channels, kind of the history of side channels was like started after World War II, and this is again the time that electronic devices become more mainstream, right? The PCs and personal computers becomes more mainstream, and as a result, unfortunately, kind of these issues also kind of come with it. And as I said at the beginning of this class, the reasons that all of these security issues has been exacerbated is because we are just having more computers and so on. So so the history was, in early 50s, a branch of US government starts noticing that there was this kind of like signals that they are observing as they're doing something else. So they accidentally observed the signals that was relevant to the things that they were doing. So they were using some form of a basic communication modulation, and they saw that the modulations, they actually can see specific signals in their kind of measurement equipment. They have like a basic oscilloscope, and they saw that as they're changing the message, they can see this. Okay. And I believe this was in upstate New York. And then what they found was, in order to demo this for their kind of superiors, they actually had a demo where like they install a device in Manhattan, and then they kind of like send a message in upstate New York, and they show that this can be intercepted from this a very long distance. And that was kind of like the important kind of wake up call for the US government at that time, that this potentially can reveal secrets about their messages, because that particular method was used for communicating messages between different branches of military and so on and so forth. And this was the starts of what this thing called Tempest program. I think Tempest was the start, it stands for there are various different names for it. I think it's one is telecommunication electronic material protected from emanating spurious transmissions. That's why it's called Tempest. The other report says that this is more of like a code that was used. But in any case, Tempest was this secret program in the US intelligence for the longest time, for 20, 30 years. Now it's just a standard that everybody knows about. But at that time, it was like a secret program within the US intelligence in order to make sure that all the devices that is used for, sensitive approaches and sensitive functionalities, including like communication between different branches of military and so on, has to make sure that they are not vulnerable to this attacks, specifically this sort of electromagnetic radiations, EMRs, that was created as because of this kind of artifact of the way that the devices was working. And as I said, in late 60s, it becomes like a full-on important projects in US government to kind of make sure that there's nothing leaking information. Later on, this becomes more in mainstream in the everyday's use and more commercial devices as well. So one of the big ones is like the screens. In the 70s and 80s, where the screens becomes more mainstream, like everybody had TVs and so on, people actually shown that using an antenna from a few meters away from the device without actually seeing the screen, you can actually collect the information and you can recreate what was been shown on the screen. And that was what they call like Van Eyck freaking. There's actually a very old YouTube video on this. If you want, you can check it out. And then the interesting thing about at that point was, in everyday use, you are also vulnerable to this kind of attacks. More recently, then once the credit card was introduced in early 90s, that was when the kind of the side channels attacks were at their peak, because initially these devices, similar to these medical devices that we just discussed, they didn't really properly follow any sort of cryptography for sending and receiving data. So people can easily use side channels in order to replicate the code and then abuse, of course, your credit card information or generally your card information in order to do unauthorized transactions. And this credit card business actually now is a very sophisticated one, and now it's very, very robust against this type of attacks, because that was kind of like the main motivations of side channels. More recently, of course, there's kind of this attacks and defenses kind of grow together. Most of the systems are kind of robust against side channels, because side channels is one of the very well-known problems in security, but there's still many different types of attacks that I'm going to describe later in the slides. A big one is what's called keylogging, which means that, as you're kind of typing on various different keyboards, people can actually, based on the side channels created by pressing the keys, they can actually find out what has been typed. And what has been typed could be a secret information, for example, could be your password and so on. There are many different types of attacks for keylogging. For example, people have shown by just looking at the video streams, they can find it. By listening to the sound of the keys, they can find it. Of course, the electromagnetic signals generated by pressing key and how long you're pressing each key can find it. There are a whole bunch of different attacks and keylogging in order to find this a very kind of explored area. Yeah.
If each key makes the same or like very similar sound, how can you extract that information?
Great question. So, I mean, the intuition is so first of all, this is the theory is that, not every key makes the same sound because there's made slightly differently. The second is the location of each key relative to the microphone is different, right? So the key that is closer to the microphone versus the key that is the farthest away from the microphone, they generate different sounds, and that's how the attacker can find this information. Another thing is it's not necessarily finding the characters, but also the number of characters. For example, I can at least say how many characters you've put in, right? Or for example, like the space bar versus the characters, like, there's a visible difference between the space bar, for example, or the enter press button or something like that, right? Or if you're holding two keys versus one key. So there's these things. Then there's also difference between the timing of the keys. So if you're like, typing two words next to each other, then the difference between the timing of those sounds very small versus if I press one key and then press another key, if the timing is a little bit more, it means that these two are farther away. So there's a whole bunch of information that you can actually extract from these keys, even if their sounds are exactly similar. So there's lots of information there. And then always usually these key logging are combined with some form of other searching algorithm. So for example, let's say start with brute force. Let's say you want to find a password. If you start with just blind brute forcing, you don't know the size, you don't know how many characters, and you don't know anything, right? Versus, for example, if I tell you now the password is actually 6 characters because I heard 6 clicks. Then I can tell you also that, for example, 2 of the first characters are close to each other versus the other 2 are far from each other, right? So now your search space shrinks because now you say, okay, assuming that the first character is A, the possibility of the second character is only kind of the neighboring keys, right? So maybe 6, 7 keys, not 26 or 36 keys. So this, then it's kind of like, eats up the search space. So much faster attacks. Just because of the smaller key space. Yeah, and then there will be new applications I'm going to talk about soon. So yeah, let's go back to kind of this more formalism. And as I said, we usually assume that f of x is known. That is, we know what f is. The main reason for this is that if you remember the security by obscurity or the Shannon theorem, that you don't want to keep anything secret in terms of the activities. We want to make sure that our system is secure despite the adversary knows what the algorithm is. Okay. So and then again, so basically the cryptography problem becomes a floor kind of thing problem. We already talked about kind of the algorithm, the keys, the implementation, but now the additional information is the side channel. So that's why it potentially can be breakable. It's not like, our math was wrong or our assumptions was wrong. Everything was correct. We just didn't assume that there was like the side channel information extra. Okay, so what are the different types of side channels? There are 3 main types of side channels that I'm going to describe. The first one is what we call simple analysis, SA or SPA or SMA. And then this is basically just a visual examination or simple examination of the signal. Okay. For example, take a look at this. Okay. So let's say that your program has 2 different phases. As you can visually see, you can actually kind of like, very clearly divide this program into these 2 separate phases, right? So for example, you see kind of like this pattern like this, or you kind of see a pattern like this, right? So as you can see, these are kind of like these patterns are very clear, right? The others are these kind of patterns like this, right? So now that I kind of detected the 2 different phases, now if I, for example, know the algorithm, then I can kind of like map these phases into the algorithm. For example, this particular one is actually kind of part of a well-known RSA, part of an RSA algorithm. If you remember in RSA, we had the ciphertext, which was, the plain text to the power of E mod n, and decryption was kind of like part of the decryption was ciphertext to the power of D mod n, right? So there's kind of like the multiplication happening at this point. There's this very well-known algorithm called modular exponentiation, which essentially what it does is that doing the square and multiply, or just doing the squaring and not multiplying. The reason for this is if D is D itself could be a sequence of bits, right? So for example, 0, 1, 0, 1, 0. So what you can do is that if this is 0, then you can skip things, right? You don't need to multiply the data if you want to kind of like, multiply a big number. If the bits are 0, you don't need to multiply it, right? You can just skip it. Okay. How do we know that we don't need to multiply it or not? You just check the bits of, for example, your secret key, and based on that decide. Okay. As a result, this algorithm is just doing either squaring or doing squaring and multiplication, depending on whether the bits is 0 or 1. If the bit is 1, you do both the multiply and squaring. If the bit is 0, you just need to square it to just add it to the next number. If you're interested, you can definitely take a look at the algorithm. This is kind of what's called a modular exponential algorithm. It's not just the only way of computing RSA, but it's one of the very well-known type of RSA. So what can I learn from this? So basically, it's first of all, I need to kind of detect these two different phases. But now by looking and scanning the code, I can easily say that whenever I see this, it means that I square and multiply together, which means that the bits of that particular bits of the secret key, in this case D, was equal to 1. Okay, so if I actually want to recreate the signal, this means that this is 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 1, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, right? So that's easy, as simple as that. I know what D is. And I'm showing only a snapshot, of course, but you can assume that, for example, if this is a 32-bit or 1,240 bits and so on and so forth, all I need to do is just collecting the signal, being able to kind of, kind of snip it into smaller pieces and detect the difference between the phases. And then based on that, I will know the key, right? And this is, as I said, this is called simple analysis because the analysis is very straightforward. You can even visually see what's the difference between the two, okay? Another example of simple analysis is something like this. This is not particularly a crypto function, but this is just the ping operation of like the ping command in your Linux system. Actually, if you look at the signals, the power signals you receive from doing this activity on the device, you will see that basically the y-axis is the amount of power and the x-axis is the time. You kind of see very different behavior, kind of things going up and down, but you kind of can see the very clear patterns, right? So for example, there's this kind of this pattern, then there's this pattern, then there's kind of this pattern, and so on and so forth. And then actually, if you kind of, again, go back to the code and try to map these patterns to the code, you will see that, for example, at this point, it was where the packet creation was done. This is actually when the actual packet was sent and it was waiting for the reception. And this was kind of like more of a delay calculations in order to see how long does it take for the ping to kind of receive and so on and so forth. And as you can see, this kind of like give you ideas about various different parts of the program. And then you can now measure how long each one took. Why would this be important? For example, let's say if I can kind of like, map this information to how far my server is, right? So if this is like short versus if this is long, right? So I can, for example, tell whether this particular computer is talking to like a nearby server or a further away server. Or the delay calculation is depending on what sort of information has been received. And again, there is a whole bunch of other things that the attacker can do in order to understand what is happening when a particular application is done. And then if you remember, the main thing about side channel was all of this information are measured externally. That is, the device itself has no idea that you're measuring these things. That's why it's a security problem. All right, another simple analysis is AES, and as you can see, I think it's triple. I'm not sure if triple does or AES. Anyway, one of the symmetric key algorithms. And as you can see, again, the signal. I'm not sure how well you can see it, but it's kind of like the signal is like looks something like this, and then as you can see, this is kind of like the part that is showing here. You can clearly see that, for example, there is 12 rounds or 10 rounds of AES. There is kind of like the initialization phase, and there's some form of like kind of final phase. And again, this will help you to kind of know exactly when everything is happening. One important thing about the simple analysis is that although itself might not reveal anything, it helps you to know the timings of things. And when you know the timings of things, then you can actually apply more sophisticated attacks that I'm going to describe actually later. Then together you can have a very sophisticated attack. Okay? Questions so far for simple analysis? All right, great. So there are challenges, of course, for simple analysis. So by the way, simple analysis, depending on what sort of simple analysis we do, we call it like usually SPA or SEA. When we say SPA, it means simple power analysis. Which means that the side channels that we are looking at is power consumption. If it's SEA, it means that it's electromagnetic. So the difference between SPA and SEA is a simple power analysis or a simple electromagnetic analysis. Of course, if you use other side channels like temperature, would be STA and so on and so forth. But typically, as I said, we usually for side channels we look either at power or electromagnetic. These are the most popular ones. So what are the problem with SPA or SEA? The problem with SPA, the challenges from the attacker's perspective is that these things are simple to remove because as the kind of the defender knows about that, potentially this could reveal information, you can start convoluting things, right? So you can mix things up such that it's not very clear now that what we are doing in terms of which phase of program it is. If I start like doing random things, then the signal that is received is going to be a combination of various different things, okay? And then another thing is that I can make these various different phases of the program very similar to each other, right? So for example, I can make this part and this part a little bit more similar. Or if you, for example, look at this particular figure, you see that since AES is kind of repeating the exact same things 10 times or 12 times and so on, you will see that, although I can count this number, but there's no more information about what's going on within each round, right? Because the exact same thing happens over and over. So simple analysis can give me some information, but from the attacker's perspective, this might not be enough. So there are more things that needs to be done. What should be done is what we call a differential power analysis, or DPA or DAA. The idea of differential power analysis is that don't look at just one instance, run many instances of the attack, just collect as many signals that you can, let's say thousands or even millions of instances, and try to kind of average them together and then kind of form some hypothesis. And if this hypothesis is correct, then we can actually kind of doing some more sophisticated outcome or guess from the system. Okay, so more specifically, let's say there is an unknown value. Let's say, if you remember, I said that we want to find X, okay? We can make some guesses about X, okay? And then we can collect many samples. And then what we can do is that we can group these samples based on the value that we have guessed for input. So for example, say, okay, I'm going to use this technique that whenever I see, for example, this particular part of signal, I'm going to assume that this is 0. And then when I say another signal that doesn't have this, I'm going to assume that this is 1. So I'm going to have basically kind of like just some theory based on some observation or theory that I have, that whenever I see this, I'm going to put it into group of zeros. Whenever I don't see this, I'm going to put it in group of 1. And then I'm going to collect many instances of this, thousands and thousands, okay? Then what I'm going to do is that I'm going to average them, each group, to create one average sample for each group, okay? So all these samples here, I'm going to average them out and then have one sample. I'm going to do the same for the other. And the basic, like the central theorem of differential analysis is that if these algorithm that you use in order to kind of group these signals, is truly what was the main reasons for your signal, then these two signals should actually be different. Otherwise, they should be exactly the same. Why? Because what you have observed was just a random transient noise. And on average, this transient noise is going to be averaged out and going to be observed among both two classes. So essentially, if you kind of subtract these two signals from each other, you're not going to see any difference between the two signals. Yeah.
So if you don't see a difference between the two signals, you just iterate and keep trying different assumptions for X.
Yeah. Yes. So you kind of like start with a guess, and then you do this, and then you see whether that guess was correct or not. If it wasn't correct, then you have to make another guess, right? And then you start to group them together again. And so the idea is that I need to find some grouping. Of course, I don't know what that grouping is. If I had known, then I didn't know to do this. This is basically a simple power analysis. But let's just start with some form of a guess. Group them into two groups, average this one, average this one. If this was a random guess, the results would be also two random variables, which if you average them, like, subtract them, would be 0. If this was indeed the correct guess, then you would detect the difference. And then that means that you find the key. Yeah.
Will your failures point you in the right direction? Is there any way to?
Good question. So I would say no. So it's not like a search problem in a sense. So it's more of like just a brute force problem. So you just have to really just test. But of course, if you're more experienced, then you might come up with a better guess. Or for example, if you analyze the code, you might come up with better guesses and so on. But in general, not really. Yeah.
So you have no control over what the system is doing, right? So how do you know that you're collecting relevant stuff?
You usually have control over the device. So the idea is that you don't know the key, but you can, for example, send input and output to this. Like you can send different inputs and you can observe different outputs. Okay. So the idea is, again, if you remember here, let me see where I have it. Yeah, so I have control over x and f of x. So I know what x is, I know what f of x is. What I don't know is what key is. So for example, I know x, I know f of x and k, but I don't know what k is, okay? And then assumption is that I can send x's, like I can send many x's. It's still not like infinite number, but like a large number. Right? And of course, the less x is, the less amount of x you need to query, the better the attack is, the faster the attack is, and all those things. But again, this can be done, for example, with thousands or thousands of samples. Okay. Yeah, so we compare them into two groups. And then, as I said, there are two possibilities. Either your assumption was not correct. As a result, the difference is 0 because you're kind of randomly grouping two groups together. The center theorem, the limits, the large numbers theory means that, the difference would be 0. If the assumption was indeed correct, then it means that you actually classify them based on a specific, criteria, and that criteria could cause different distributions. And then, yeah, so for example, you can do group and powers based on that. There's this example. I don't think we have enough time to go over it. So why don't we stop here? And then I'm going to start with this example next time we talk about this. Okay. Don't forget about your CAs. If there are questions, let me know. And then we're going to post the next CA also sometime this week. Okay. Any final questions? Cool. So we're gonna start from here next time.